Good morning. My name is Malcolm Bain and I have been invited by the UPO to participate in this Master in Free Software Management and to present some of the legal aspects of open source licensing. I am a lawyer, I work in Barcelona, and I have been working with open source projects and open source procurement in public administration for many years now. The focus of the 4 videos I will be presenting is the relationship between FOSS licensing and copyright, and my colleagues Carlo Piana and Marco Ticina will be presenting other legal issues in this area. The objective for this specific unit of the module is to present the main background, copyright background that applies to open source licensing, and to present how the proprietary traditional software industry has used this for proprietary licensing. This is the first video of 4, and the next videos we will look at open source licensing as such, how to use open source licenses in open source projects, and managing copyright in the area of free and open source licensing. This specific video will look at 2 areas. First, we will do a quick review of materials that you have already seen, which is the IPR protection for software focusing on copyright, and then we will look at traditional licensing models. So, why do this? Well, the principal reason for talking about the background of legal protection of software is that the main difference between free and open source licensing and proprietary license is in the legal environment. There are differences in the technical and organizational aspects, but the main difference is in the license, and that means that we need to understand the background to this licensing, which is mainly copyright, and which is what I'm presenting here. There are other areas of law which apply to software, such as patents, trade secrets, and trademarks. And there are even database rights which can apply to certain elements of the software environment. But my colleague Carlo will be looking at these. In this one, we focus on copyright and how copyright is licensed in the proprietary area. The basic concepts of copyright as applicable to books or movies or images, pictures, apply to software. The basic rule is that copyright protects creative works, so software needs to be creative, have a minimum level of originality to acquire protection. Software protection, however, applies not to the functionalities, the actual elements of the software, what it actually does, but to the code, to the algorithms and the software code that developers write, which is the source code, which is then compiled into binary code. And once copyright does apply to a software program, what happens is that the author and then any subsequent rights holder has some exclusive rights, which you learned previously, but we will review now. These rights are 4. First and foremost is the right to make copies, which is the right to reproduce, whether it's making digital or physical copies. This will happen in any network, when you download something or when you copy something to a USB or a DVD. The second right is the right to make modifications, so to adapt or transform the software to create a new one. This could be, for example, reprogramming or redeveloping a program from C++ into another computer language like Java, or extending or modifying the functionality of a software program. The third right is the distribution right, which is the right to make copies and distribute those copies on a tangible or physical format, such as a CD or DVD, something which happens less and less these days. So more and more important is the right to communicate publicly, which is to distribute a copy over networks, such as sharing software in the internet. So these are the 4 exclusive rights that belong to the copyright holder. What is actually protected in the area of software is a bunch of different elements. The first and foremost is the source code, which is written by the developer. This gets compiled into a binary or an object code, which also has copyright protection. But copyright also covers the descriptive and preparatory documentation, the architecture designs, the case diagrams or other forms of materials used to design and then program the software. Also, supporting materials such as user manuals, administration manuals are also protected as works, as well as the graphic interface. In this bundle, we also see the computer languages that we use, like C++, and the tools used that apply these languages, such as the Eclipse development environment. What is important here, however, is that software copyright does not protect the ideas, principles, functionalities of the software. On top of that, it doesn't even protect the interfaces that for communicating with that software, the information required to communicate. And this for the principle of interoperability, so that other people can develop programs that work with your program. Okay, so there are certain elements in the software environment which are not protected, and we need to understand that software copyright protects principally the computer code that is written. Okay, why is this important? Well, three main areas. First of all, it's important to know who holds the copyrights, because that is the person who has the exclusive right to use the software and to determine the license for licensing, whether it's a free software license or a proprietary license. So we need to identify those authors, whether it's a single person, a company, a public administration, or a group of people who can jointly own the copyrights together. Secondly, we need to know what type of software or what type of program has been created, whether this is an original work, therefore it is free from any third-party rights, and we are totally open for choosing what type of license we use. On the other hand, it could be a derivative work or modification of a previous work, adaptation, or even a composite work or compiled compilation where you include third-party libraries and other software inside your program. In this case, obviously, the work is going to depend on the licensing of those components. And finally, we could also consider the figure of a collective work where a single editor or software publisher engages other different people to make different contributions and then coordinate all this into one program. The third element, therefore, to look at is exploitation. How are we going to be using this software? Whether it's purely for internal use, in which case we'll find that FOSS licenses impose no specific requirements or limitations to internal use, as opposed to distribution or public communication, where copyleft licenses may impose significant restrictions or obligations to reveal the source code and to use the same license. So the distribution model or the exploitation model is also important to understand from a copyright perspective. So once we've understood this background, that the copyright applies to software and there are different elements or rights which are applicable, we need to see how people use these rights in the different ways of licensing. And the first model we'll look at is proprietary licensing. The license itself is basically a legal instrument which enables third parties to use a software, because normally if there is no license at all, the traditional or the default rule is all rights reserved. So you have to have a license to be able to use a software. And if you find software on the internet that doesn't have a license, the basic rule is that you cannot use it. So a license gives permission to use it. And the good thing about software licensing is that it is enormously flexible. You can determine the type of rights that are granted, whether it's modification, distribution, reproduction. You can impose limitations on the user. You can impose a geographical or time limitations. And the license can be exclusive for a single licensee or non-exclusive, which means that many different people can use the software, like, for example, the Windows operating systems or other commercial software of this type. And the licensor, so the copyright holder, also takes advantage of the license to impose specific obligations or restrictions on the user. Okay, so for a proprietary license, this would mean no further copying, no distribution, no modification. Okay, but for a free an open source license, all these are permitted. So the obligations they would impose are, for example, to ensure there is recognition or attribution of the original owners, or to keep a copy of the license with the software. So this is the basic structure of a license, and in the proprietary or traditional software development model, which is hierarchical, a bit like building a cathedral, the main purpose has been to create a software once and license it many times. So what the proprietary business has done is to develop the software in-house, keep it confidential, compile it into a binary, and then distribute binaries under binary license agreements. And the rights that are granted are usually limited to specifically to install and just to use the software for internal or specific purposes. And the license then goes on to restrict all other uses. So if you look at a proprietary license, you will find that there are some common elements that are the same in many licenses. Whether it's the grant of rights limited to installation and use, whether it's the prohibition on transformation or distribution, and also contractual issues like warranty and liability disclaimers. Okay, what distinguishes one proprietary license from another is usually the commercial model. So the price of the license, how many users can use it, what type of installation can be made, and sometimes whether the user has access or not to source code. Okay, so that's the main anatomy of a proprietary license, and here I've got a couple of examples. So you look here, you'll find that this license gives a non-exclusive, non-transferable, limited license to just to use the program for a single purpose and not for any other. In this case, it's a developer license. Okay, the restrictions include only installation only on one computer by one person and in one specific operating environment. So it's a very restrictive license. And on top of that, there are limitations on how the user can use the license. Another one here you'll see is a non-exclusive, non-sublicensable, non-transferable license just to install and use the software for a specific term. So it's quite restricted in use, and the licensor then limits any possibility of making further copies, modifications, distributing or whatever, and also prevents reverse engineering disassembly. Okay, so this is the typical scenario of a proprietary license where you get limited license to use the software and not much else. Okay, and this again is a third example of typical down-user click-through license for end-user license agreements. So, just to sum up, what we have seen in this module is the basic background or legal background to copyright protection, which you've seen before, so it's a review, but also trying to apply this in the area of free and open source licensing to highlight the important elements. Who owns the rights, what type of rights we have, what type of exploitation is going to be made. And we've seen one example of this exploitation in the traditional software development and licensing model. Okay, so this is the first of 4 videos. The next one we'll look at, we'll explore in more detail open source licensing, and I will see you then for the next module.